Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honor and privilege to rise again tonight to speak to Bill C-10. And it's always an honor to speak from the unceded traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation and to serve the community of Nanaimo, Ladysmith within the traditional territory of the Snaw-Naw-As, Nanaimo, Stz'uminus, and Lyackson First Nations. Hajkasiem. It's Aboriginal Day today, Indigenous Peoples Day, a day to celebrate the rich cultural heritage, the languages, the governance structure, and the traditions of Indigenous people of Canada. I spoke to many organizations about this bill. As an independent party, they call us the Greens. We don't have the same ability to question witnesses in committee. So I did my own meetings and had my own questions. And one of those meetings that I had was with APTN and with Indigenous producers. And I want to talk tonight about the importance of Indigenous voices in our broadcasting system. Because if we left it up to content from the United States, our view of Indigenous people would continue to be the Disneyfied view, the Pocahontas, the spaghetti westerns. And it's really important that Indigenous voices are heard. In the early 90s, my father found a letter written by a woman in 1898. She was named Elizabeth Shaw. She wrote a 18-page scathing letter about the residential school system and the abuses that were happening at the Port Simpson School. And we made a documentary out of that film, and there was a number of Indigenous people that were involved with it. And people asked me afterwards, Indigenous people asked me about some of the other experiences they had and wanted to make films as well. And I said, it's not really for me to tell your story. That's what you should be doing, and I'll help facilitate that. And I worked with a lot of Indigenous producers, young people, older people that are just interested in getting into media production, and facilitated training and mentorship so that they could tell those stories. And what came out of that actually was working with a young guy, Don Claxton. I worked with his sister, Dana Claxton, as well, who's an Indigenous artist, and played music with their sister, Kim Sue Goodtrack. And they had an idea for a show. And that was in the late 90s. And lo and behold, APTN, the Aboriginal Peoples Television Network, was born. And we produced a pilot for the first preschool show on APTN. And I worked with them and a whole bunch of First Nations, Indigenous technical crew that we worked on training to create 64 episodes of a show called Wankaja. And the idea behind CanCon is so that we can hear these important Indigenous voices. We need to make sure that these independent producers that are creating Canadian content have access to the Canadian Media Fund when they're producing for the social media streams, for the streamers like Netflix and others, rather than just with the Canadian broadcasters, because that's where a lot of this production is going. I heard a lot of discussion about freedom of expression and the YouTubers that are going to be, they have to go down because Canadian content goes up, and somebody has to go down because somebody's going up. I don't know how many times I heard that in committee during filibusters, but, and the Conservative member gave a great example of somebody that they know who does coupon clipping how-tos, and that's great. And I looked at the top 100 Canadian YouTube producers, and there was, people doing nails and gaming commentators and spoof videos and lots of content that you could see produced anywhere. You knew it was Canadian because they would drop the first A or the, get her done or said about wrong. But that's not what the idea behind CanCon is all about. This commercial content drives advertising dollars. And that's what those, commercial internet giants are all about, is selling advertising. So that's what those algorithms are designed to do. What is important in CanCon is Indigenous voices, stories from Canada's North, Canadian documentaries, stories of new Canadians, emerging Canadian musicians. Those are the programs that need to be discoverable. And that's what discoverability is about learning about each other, about Canadian stories, and not just being inundated by American culture or the dominant culture. I missed my late show tonight, and I want to talk about a Canadian story that needs to be shared and understood. You know, in recent decades, Canadians have learned more and more about our former government's attempt to commit cultural genocide, to commit genocide, to wipe out Indigenous cultures through the residential school system. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has reported extensively and provided a path forward with 94 calls to action. What most Canadians are unaware of is a parallel set of institutions, the racially segregated Indian hospital system operated by the federal government between the 1940s and 1970s. And those hospitals have their own horror stories. I first heard about the Nanaimo Indian Hospital about 15 years ago, and many people in my community have no idea that it ever existed. In 2013, I was commissioned to produce a film for the Hulkaminum Health Hub about cultural safety in the healthcare system within the Hulkaminum speaking areas. And part of that film was to give health professionals an understanding of the history of institutional racism in the healthcare and why it was that Indigenous people did not seek help when they needed medical attention. And I interviewed elders who spoke about the trauma they experienced in the Nanaimo Indian Hospital. I heard about painful treatments, and I heard about people going into the hospital who were never heard from again. As part of the research for the film, I spoke with researcher Laurie Mayer-Dries, and she's the co-chair of the First Nation Study Department at Vancouver Island University. She has documented the oral stories of people who have been in these hospitals and wrote a book entitled Healing Histories, Stories from Canada's Indian Hospitals. Of course, not all these stories were bad. Some people went to the hospital sick, were given antibiotics, and returned home feeling better. But the horrific legacy of the Indian hospitals was based on treating all Indigenous people as wards of the state. Consent for medical treatment only came into being for the general public in the 1960s. However, as wards of the state, Indigenous people were not asked to consent for their hospitalization or treatment. The system patronizingly viewed them as lacking the capacity to give consent. An Indigenous person could be arrested by the RCMP for not going to the hospital if instructed to do so by a doctor. That twisted, racist mentality facilitated and led to women being sterilized without giving consent, and patients being subject to experiments with medication without their prior knowledge. These hospitals were underfunded and understaffed. Family members and communities were not updated on loved ones in the hospital. People died, children were shipped off to residential school or adopted out, and family members were never informed. Some children were taken to hospital and years later no longer knew who they were, what their real names were, or where they came from. Most of what is known about this dark history, comes from oral accounts told to researchers and shared through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but the medical files are locked and researchers have not been granted permission to access them. Apparently, the reason given is that those records contain personal information. It is important to protect personal information. However, we do need to expose personal information in order to get, we don't need to expose personal information in order to get to the bottom of what happened. In order to heal from those past traumas, we need to know the truth. The truth is sealed in those medical records, and it is incumbent upon this government to give researchers and independent adjudicators appropriate clearance, access, and analysis of this data to conduct a full independent inquiry. And I'm looking forward to a First Nations producer, an Indigenous producer, creating a documentary about this and having members of this place finding this through discoverability on YouTube, because these are stories that we need to hear. These are the truths we need to hear. We also need to hear about the rich cultural heritage of Indigenous people. Let's talk about censorship. We're worried about censorship. The real concern about censorship are these large corporations. On May 5th, Red Dress Day, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Day, family, friends, loved ones were posting about their missing loved ones. Thousands of those posts disappeared. And right here in my community, I know Elise Marie Young went missing years ago. What happened to all these posts? They were all pulled by Instagram. And this is happening with other things like Black Lives Matter, Israel and Palestine, Sheikh Jarrah, SOS Colombia. I heard one of the conservatives saying that their posts are missing, right-wing posts, but this is clearly not conservative posts. Freedom of speech is important to me, and we need to uphold it, and I think that this bill does. And I think my time's up, Mr. Speaker, and I'm happy to take some questions and add some more.
And that you will have. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Cumberland, Colchester.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for his comments. And I want to say, you know, the arts are such an important part of our woven tapestry here in Canada. Indigenous arts, arts from across the cultures. And so what is it about this bill that the member actually supports, and why should this bill be passed? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, I'm a huge supporter of the arts, and I've worked in the cultural industries in this country for a long time. And I've worked as a professional musician, but I've also worked in artist management. So I know how the MAPLE system works. The music, artist, production, and lyrics determine, you know, 2 out of 4 of those, and you got CanCon, and you can get that on for radio play. And I understand how the certification works for CRTC. It's a very easy checkbox. You know, who's the director, who's the producer, who's the writer, who are the creative key talents on that? You need 6 out of 10. You got Canadian content, and it's important that we bring those voices forward and that we support Canadian content because we have unique stories to tell in this country.
And comments? The Honourable Member for Battle River, Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I listened with great interest both to this speech and the speech previously, and specifically his impassioned explanation of Indigenous history that needs to be told. But my concern is that allowing the state to determine what, and in this case the CRTC as an agent of the state, to prioritize what content meets a certain satisfactory requirement to be prioritized in the next to play or the algorithm that shows up in someone's feed is what the concern is. And if the state, for example, was to try and diminish some of its history, then it would put the very content that he is so passionately defending at risk of being silenced. So I'm just curious as to how that member would reconcile some of the concerns that have been outlined with this bill about the possibility of state intervention, and specifically with the Liberals being able to determine what that may or may not be, how he reconciles that with the need to ensure that there is actual freedom of expression so that these voices can be heard, and in the example that he shared, that this Canadian history can be told and accessed.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, look, the CRTC has not silenced speech in the past, and all you need to do is look at Rick Mercer's show. He made fun of politicians and governments freely and had no problem. He was never censored. I find it hilarious to hear the previous Conservative speaker say that he's never read the bill or the act, but he doesn't trust it because the Liberals put it forward. And what you need to know as Conservatives is that the 1991 Act was created by the Mulroney government, the Mulroney Conservative government. And it quite clearly states in that Act, and this remains in the Act, this Act shall be construed and applied in a manner that is consistent with freedom of expression and journalistic, creative, and programming independence enjoyed by broadcasting undertakings. That's the language of the Conservative bill that was established in 1991. It remains in this Act, and we still have freedom of speech under the Broadcasting Act.
Nous avons le temps juste pour une...
We have time for one short question. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciated the last response from my colleague from Nanaimo, Ladysmith. I thought that was a particularly delicious answer. I'd like to ask him, what does he think about the fact that cable companies, who there are fewer of them, they have fewer clients, are the only ones who are contributing to original Canadian content, and that web giants like Netflix or Disney Plus or Crave are excluded from that and don't help or with artistic cultural creation in Canada? The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Well, I think it's about high time that those other internet giants all contributed to the Canadian content and put money into the Canadian Media Fund, and that the Canadian Media Fund is opened up, and this is one of my amendments, to have the Canadian Media Fund available to independent producers who are producing for those streaming services, so that somebody making a documentary that is just going to go out onto YouTube could actually get Canadian Media Fund money to help them tell good Canadian stories.